For nearly 2 decades, the name Napoleon had been enough to change the shape of Europe. It was whispered in palaces and shouted in barracks, a name that made kings reassess their borders and generals redraw their maps. His armies had crossed the Rhine and the Danube, swept through Italy, crushed Prussia, humbled Austria, and even threatened the heart of Russia. They were more than just soldiers. They were an instrument of will, disciplined columns drilled to perfection, artillery batteries that could break a city's defenses in hours, cavalry brigades that moved faster than any army Europe had seen before. Where they marched, empires fell. Where they paused, treaties were rewritten. The Grande Armée was not merely a military force. It was a moving statement of inevitability. By the time the mid-19th century dawned, that same aura of unstoppable power had shifted from Napoleon himself, now long dead, to the way of war he had perfected. The great continental armies that followed, French and Russian alike, still fought in the shadow of his doctrine. They believed in the strength of overwhelming numbers, in the crushing weight of massed infantry, in the thunderous momentum of artillery and cavalry working in concert. To men raised on stories of Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram, the idea that a handful of infantry could stand in the way of tens of thousands was not simply improbable, it was impossible. And yet, by 1854, Europe was once again sliding into war. This time the prize was not Paris or Vienna, but a wind-scoured peninsula jutting into the Black Sea. The Crimean War, born from rivalry over influence in the decaying Ottoman Empire, brought together uneasy allies, Britain and France, former enemies now united against Russian expansion, and the Ottomans themselves, desperate to hold their crumbling empire together. The stakes were not merely territorial. They were about trade routes, imperial prestige, and the balance of power that had defined Europe since Napoleon's fall. Russia sought a warm water port and dominance over the straits. Britain sought to contain the Tsar's ambitions. France sought to reclaim its role as Europe's arbiter. As armies gathered, the ghosts of the Napoleonic age loomed large. Russia could field massive forces, tens of thousands of infantry, heavy cavalry, and cannons that could blast through stone. France still prided itself on precision drill, bold maneuver, and shock tactics honed under the Emperor's banner. Even Britain, with its smaller professional army, believed that discipline and firepower could compensate for numerical inferiority. And yet, among them all, a shared belief persisted, that weight of numbers and force of will were the true arbiters of victory. No formation of men, however brave, could stand against a tidal wave of thousands. The soldiers who would soon march into the valley near Balaclava carried this certainty with them. Russian infantry, hardened by campaigns against the Ottomans, advanced with bayonets glinting in the pale Crimean light. French allies brought their own artillery, confident in the methods that had shattered enemy lines for decades. Even British commanders, cautious and skeptical by nature, doubted that any single battalion could hold against overwhelming assault. The world had grown accustomed to seeing battles decided by mass and momentum, not by fragile human will. But history has a way of humbling certainty. What those armies did not yet understand was that war was changing. Rifled muskets gave infantrymen reach and accuracy their fathers had never known. Discipline, drilled into regiments over years of peacetime parade and colonial policing, could now multiply a small unit's strength beyond mere numbers. Above all, the psychology of battle, the confidence that great armies could not be stopped, was more fragile than anyone dared admit. It was into this world of towering armies and imperial ambition that a single regiment of Highlanders would soon march. They were professional soldiers, yes, but not gods of war. They were farmers' sons and shepherds' boys who had traded the hills of Scotland for a musket and a scarlet tunic. They would stand shoulder to shoulder on an open field without the safety of earthworks or cavalry screens, and they would face down an enemy that outnumbered them 50-1. And when they did, they would do more than stop a charge. They would shatter an illusion that had ruled European battlefields since the days when Napoleon himself had ridden at the head of an empire. The iron tide that once swept aside kingdoms and crowned emperors was about to meet something older and far more stubborn than steel, the quiet resolve of men who refused to step back. It would not look like victory at first glance. There would be no sweeping maneuvers or glorious cavalry charges, just a thin red line, steady as stone, holding fast against the weight of history itself. And as the thunder of thousands bore down upon them, Europe would learn a truth it had, forgotten since the age of empire began, that sometimes courage is enough. The Crimean Peninsula had always been more than a stretch of land. It was a bridge between worlds, a wedge of earth that linked Europe to Asia and looked out over the waters that separated empires. Whoever controlled it could dominate the Black Sea and, by extension, influence the trade routes and warm water ports that sustained both commerce and conquest. By the mid-19th century, it had become the focus of a struggle far larger than the rocky hills and wind-lashed shores that defined its geography. It was the place where ambition, faith, pride and power collided, and where the world's greatest empires prepared to test one another once again. The seeds of the conflict were sown long before a single musket was fired. Russia, under Tsar Nicholas I, had grown increasingly bold in asserting itself as the protector of Orthodox Christians within the crumbling Ottoman Empire. To the Tsar, this was both a matter of faith and a pretext for expansion. The Ottoman state, once feared and formidable, was now known as the sick man of Europe, a declining empire that could no longer defend its far-flung provinces or police its restless subjects. Nicholas saw an opportunity. If Russia could extend its influence southward, seize control of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, and dominate the Black Sea, it would become a naval power whose reach stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. 4. Britain and France, that vision was intolerable. British policymakers feared that Russian control of the Straits would endanger their routes to India, the jewel of their empire. France, eager to reassert itself as a major power after the Napoleonic era, saw an opportunity to check Russian ambitions and bolster its own prestige. Even Austria, though hesitant to commit fully, watched nervously as Russian troops pressed southward, knowing that their expansion could destabilize the delicate balance of power that had defined Europe since 1815. The Ottoman Empire, desperate to preserve what remained of its sovereignty, welcomed Western assistance. Thus, unlikely allies, Britain, France, and the Ottomans, found themselves bound together by a shared goal: to contain Russia and prevent it from rewriting the political map of Europe. The flashpoint came in 1853, when Russian troops marched into the Danubian principalities, Ottoman territories in modern-day Romania. Diplomacy failed quickly. Ottoman resistance turned into open war. When the Russian Black Sea Fleet destroyed an Ottoman squadron at Sinope that November, killing hundreds of sailors in a devastating barrage of explosive shells, outrage swept through Europe. Britain and France declared war the following spring, but rather than fight in the Balkans, the Allies chose a bold strategy: strike directly at the heart of Russian naval power by capturing Sevastopol, the fortress city that anchored Russia's Black Sea Fleet. That decision shifted the war to Crimea. By the autumn of 1854, tens of thousands of soldiers were on the move: British redcoats, French zouaves, Ottoman infantry, and Russian conscripts trudging through the rugged peninsula's dusty valleys and scrub-covered hills. The geography itself was a challenge. Roads were little more than rutted tracks, supply lines stretched thin, and the climate was unforgiving. Yet all roads led to Sevastopol. Without it, Russian influence in the Black Sea would collapse. With it, The Tsar could threaten not only Ottoman lands, but also British and French naval power. As the Allies landed on the Crimean coast and advanced inland, they encountered not only the Russian army, but also the realities of 19th century warfare. Disease and poor sanitation killed more men than bullets. Communication was unreliable, logistics chaotic, and leadership often paralyzed by indecision or arrogance. Yet despite these hardships, the campaign pressed forward. The first major engagement at Alma in September 1854 saw Allied forces push back Russian defenders and open the path to Sevastopol. The siege that followed would become one of the longest and bloodiest of the century. But to reach the fortress, the Allies needed secure supply lines, and that meant holding Balaclava. A modest port town with a sheltered harbour, Balaclava was vital to the British effort. It was the lifeline through which food, ammunition and reinforcements flowed. If the Russians could capture it, the entire siege would falter. They understood this and prepared a massive offensive to seize the town and sever the British Army's support. What followed was a campaign that would test the resolve of every man on the peninsula. Vast armies clashed across open fields, cavalry charges thundered into musket fire, and artillery duels shook the earth. Yet amid all the chaos and slaughter, one moment would rise above the rest. A moment not defined by sweeping maneuvers or overwhelming firepower, but by a single line of men in red coats standing firm against impossible odds. Before the war was over, Balaclava would become a name spoken with awe and disbelief, and the thin red line would enter history as proof that even the most powerful ambitions can be broken by steadfast resolve. When the British Army landed in Crimea, there was little of the grandeur often associated with imperial campaigns. It was not a mighty host sweeping across the continent, nor a force brimming with the latest technologies of war. It was, instead, a small and often fragile expeditionary army, professional, disciplined and courageous, but undermanned, under-equipped and frequently mismanaged. Its mission was simple to describe, yet daunting to execute. Protect the alliance's supply routes, hold the key terrain that shielded those routes, and prevent the Russian Empire from breaking through to the sea. It was a task that demanded endurance more than brilliance, and it was fought not in the name of conquest, but of containment. The British force that marched inland from the beaches of Crimea in 1854 numbered fewer than 30,000. They were veterans of colonial campaigns in India and the Middle East, men who had fought in distant lands under blistering suns and freezing deserts. But many had never faced a modern European army on open ground. Their muskets were reliable but dated, their artillery formidable but limited, and their logistical system, the lifeblood of any sustained campaign, was stretched to the breaking point. Supplies arrived weeks late, wagons broke down in the mud, and food rotted in transit. Even the simplest necessities, from tents to boots, were in short supply. Leadership was another weakness. The British command structure was burdened by senior officers who owed their positions more to social rank than battlefield experience. Lord Raglan, the army's commander, was a veteran of Waterloo, but had not commanded troops in combat for decades. His staff was divided by rivalries and confused by poor communication, and orders often took hours to reach the front lines. Decisions that could have turned the tide of a battle were delayed or misunderstood, and opportunities to press advantages were too often lost to hesitation. It was a pattern that would plague the British campaign from start to finish. Worse still was the enemy that stalked the camps long before the Russians arrived: disease. Cholera swept through the ranks, killing thousands. Dysentery, typhus and scurvy followed, claiming more lives than bullets or bayonets ever would. The hospitals were overwhelmed, sanitation was appalling, and medical knowledge was too limited. To stop the spread, Soldiers who survived battle often succumbed to sickness soon after. It was a brutal reminder that war in the 19th century was fought as much against nature as against human foes. Yet for all these hardships, the British soldiers who dug in on the rolling plains outside Sevastopol understood the stakes. Their task was not to win glory or seize territory, but to hold. Balaclava, the small port town that served as their lifeline, had to be protected. The high ridges overlooking the valley had to remain in Allied hands. If the Russians broke through, the siege of Sevastopol would fail, and the entire campaign could collapse. It was a defensive war in the purest sense. One fought not for ambition, but for necessity. The terrain itself offered little comfort. The Crimean landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a patchwork of dry hills, marshy lowlands, and narrow valleys that offered little cover and few natural defenses. The roads were primitive, churning into mud with the autumn rains. Supply convoys moved slowly, vulnerable to ambush. Artillery pieces bogged down or overturned on steep inclines. The soldiers built fieldworks where they could, digging trenches and stacking earthworks. But they knew that if the Russians came in force, much of the fighting would be done in the open. And come they did. Russian forces, far larger and better supplied, prepared for a massive offensive aimed directly at Balaclava. Intelligence reports spoke of tens of thousands of infantry, vast batteries of artillery, and cavalry divisions numbering in the thousands. The British and their allies would be heavily outnumbered, perhaps 3-1, and yet retreat was unthinkable. The supply base was the heart of the Allied campaign. If it fell, the siege would wither. In the weeks before the battle, the British lines became a place of waiting, the kind of waiting soldiers dread more than combat itself. Patrols watched the horizon for movement. Artillery crews cleaned and re-cleaned their guns. Infantrymen sharpened bayonets, patched uniforms, and tried not to think about the odds. They knew the Russians were coming. They just didn't know when or from where. And when the storm finally broke, it would not be a clash of equals. It would be a desperate stand, a thin, weary line of soldiers clinging to a patch of ground that the Empire could not afford to lose. This was not a battlefield that promised medals or parades. It was one where courage would be measured not by conquest, but by endurance, and where victory would be defined not by how far an army advanced, but by whether it could remain standing at all. And when the Russian columns finally appeared on the horizon, black against the pale Crimean sky, every man in that British line knew one truth with cold certainty. There would be no glory here, only the grim, stubborn business of holding the line. Dawn broke quietly over the Crimean hills on October 25, 1854, but the stillness was deceptive. A pale mist clung stubbornly to the valley floor, hiding movement and softening the harsh shapes of cannon and wagon, hill and trench. The British soldiers who stood to their arms that morning could see little beyond a few hundred yards. Only the vague outlines of the ridges and the occasional flash of bayonet steel where the Ottoman allies held their forward positions. It was a landscape caught between peace and chaos, the final breath before the storm. Every man on that line knew that before the sun climbed far into the sky, the silence would be broken by the roar of war. The valley outside Balaclava was narrow and steep-sided, hemmed in by low hills and ridges that offered both sides advantages and risks. For the British and their Ottoman allies, it was a defensive position that could channel an enemy advance and slow its momentum. But it was also a trap. Once the Russians committed their full strength, there would be little room to maneuver. Nowhere to retreat. That did not mean abandoning the port and the vital supply base it protected. And on this morning, the stakes could not have been higher. Scouts and pickets posted along the distant approaches reported movement before dawn, the rhythmic drumbeat of marching feet echoing faintly through the mist. As the light strengthened, the truth became impossible to ignore. On the far horizon, Beyond the reach of British artillery, the first dark lines of Russian troops began to emerge from the haze. Columns so long and deep, they seemed to have no end. Infantry in grey-green uniforms stretched across the plain, their bayonets glinting as they caught the early sun. Cavalry squadrons followed, their banners rippling, their sabres flashing, while lumbering artillery wagons trailed behind, the iron mouths of their guns already angled toward the British positions. It was a sight designed to crush morale before a single shot was fired. Nearly 68,000 Russian soldiers had marched to Balaclava, an overwhelming force by any calculation, and they advanced with the measured confidence of men who believed they could not be stopped. On the British side, fewer than 25,000 stood, ready, a fragile coalition of red-coated infantry, blue-jacketed artillerymen, Ottoman auxiliaries, and a cavalry division that was brave but too small to meet the Russian horse on equal terms. The sheer disparity was staggering. For every British soldier in the field, nearly 3 Russians advanced against him, yet even outnumbered, the defenders did not break. Orders were barked along the lines as officers moved quickly to prepare for the assault. The Ottoman troops, positioned furthest forward, tightened their formations and checked their ammunition pouches. The British infantry formed ranks on the slopes behind them, bayonets fixed, their scarlet coats bright against the pale earth. On the higher ground, artillery crews rolled their guns into position, sighting the distant ridges and adjusting their angles by hand. And in the shallow hollows behind the front, the British cavalry waited, the heavy brigade ready to countercharge if the Russians broke through, the light brigade held in reserve, unaware of the infamous ride that awaited them from the command post atop the Sapune Heights. Lord Raglan surveyed the battlefield through his telescope. He could see the Russian advance taking shape, its scale now unmistakable. They were deploying in 3 great movements: infantry columns pressing down the northern heights, cavalry masses forming near the causeway heights in the center, and artillery batteries being dragged into position to pound the Allied line from afar. It was a methodical, relentless build-up of force, a classic Russian strategy meant to grind down defenders by sheer weight and persistence. The British plan was less ambitious, but no less vital: hold. They would not win this battle with sweeping maneuvers or grand offensives. Their mission was to buy time, to keep Balaclava's port secure, and to prevent the Russians from cutting off the siege of Sevastopol. Every minute they held would matter. Every hill they refused to yield would delay the Russian timetable. And if they could inflict enough casualties and slow the advance, they might even force the Tsar's generals to rethink their attack altogether. As the morning mist began to lift, the valley transformed from a quiet landscape into a stage set for catastrophe. Officers rode down the lines, steadying their men with brief, clipped words. Drums beat signals through the ranks. Far in the distance, the Russian guns boomed. The first dull thunder of a day that would be remembered for centuries. Shells screamed overhead and burst against the slopes, showering the defenders with earth and stone. The battle for Balaclava had begun. It was in that moment, beneath a pale autumn sky and against impossible odds, that the courage of ordinary soldiers would be tested in ways few had imagined. They could not know how history would remember the fight, that it would give birth to legendary phrases and immortal acts of bravery. All they knew was that the enemy was coming, in numbers that defied belief, and that they had been given a single, unyielding order: stand and hold the line. The first cannon shots that shattered the morning silence were more than just the opening of battle. They were the beginning of a meticulously calculated plan. The Russian High Command had no illusions about subtlety. They did not intend to dance around the Allied positions or attempt complex maneuvers. Their strategy was built on the overwhelming weight of numbers, a tactic that had served them well in countless wars before. The objective was clear and brutal in its simplicity: break through the Allied left flank, seize Balaclava and its vital harbour, and in doing so split the British and French armies apart. If the port fell, the siege of Sevastopol would collapse, and with it the entire Allied campaign. The plan began with the thunder of artillery. Russian guns, dragged laboriously into position on the distant ridges during the night, now opened fire in unison. Shells howled across the valley and burst among the Ottoman redoubts that formed the forward edge of the Allied line. Earthworks crumbled under the bombardment, wooden palisades splintered, and men were thrown from their posts in a storm of dirt and shrapnel. The Ottoman defenders, poorly armed and lacking the discipline of their British counterparts, tried to return fire with their smaller field pieces, but the disparity was hopeless. Within minutes, the Russian gunners had silenced them. Then the infantry began to move. Long columns of grey-coated soldiers advanced in steady ranks, bayonets fixed, drums beating the slow rhythm of inevitability. They did not charge. They marched, an unstoppable tide of humanity rolling down from the hills and across the plain. Behind them came more, reserves to exploit any breakthrough, sappers to tear down what defences they encountered, and engineers to turn captured ground into footholds. Above them, the sky was filled with the smoke of their guns, drifting like a shroud over the battlefield. The Ottoman positions were the first to feel the weight of the assault. Outnumbered and outgunned, their resolve began to crumble under the pressure. Redoubt after redoubt fell as the Russian infantry surged forward. Small groups fought stubbornly, firing until their ammunition ran dry, but most broke and fled toward the rear, abandoning the forward line. The collapse left a dangerous gap in the Allied defences, exactly the opening the Russians had been hoping for. Through that breach, the cavalry poured in. Russian horsemen, their sabres flashing, advanced. In wave after wave, hooves pounding the ground like rolling thunder. Their task was to exploit the panic, to scatter what remained of the Ottoman line, and to sweep deep into the Allied rear. The sheer spectacle of their charge was enough to chill even veteran soldiers. To the British, watching from the higher ground, it seemed as though the valley itself was moving, a great mass of horse and steel driving toward them with unstoppable momentum. For a moment, it seemed as if the battle would end before it truly began. The left flank had collapsed. The Russians were advancing rapidly, and nothing stood between them and Balaclava but a thin scattering of Allied troops, hastily forming new defensive positions. It was a moment of crisis, the kind of moment when armies either shatter or discover the full measure of their resolve, and resolve was what remained. Amid the retreating Ottomans, a small contingent of British regulars moved forward, not back. The 93rd Highlanders, under Sir Colin Campbell, took up position along a ridge behind the shattered redoubts. Their numbers were pitiful compared to the approaching enemy, a mere few hundred men facing thousands. Yet they did not waver. Campbell's orders were simple and absolute. There would be no retreat, no fallback, no surrender of the ground. They were to stand and fight, whatever the cost. Beside them, elements of the Guards Brigade formed up, their bayonets glinting in the morning light. They too understood the stakes. If they could not hold, the Russians would sweep through the valley, overrun the supply base, and drive a wedge between the Allied armies. The fate of the campaign, perhaps the entire war, hung on their ability to hold a line that should not have been able to hold at all. The Russian columns pressed closer, their numbers growing clearer with each passing minute. The ground trembled beneath the hooves of the cavalry, and the air grew thick with the acrid stench of powder and smoke. Yet still the Highlanders did not move. They waited, muskets levelled, hearts steady, knowing that the coming minutes would decide everything. Against them came the full weight of an empire, tens of thousands of men, steel-tipped and relentless, and against that weight the British line stood thin and defiant, a fragile wall of red and resolve prepared to face the storm. The red coats of the 93rd Highlanders glowed against the pale autumn light, like a streak of fire drawn across the drab Crimean landscape. They were not a large regiment, just 550 men in total, but they carried with them a reputation forged in distant wars and bitter campaigns. They were disciplined, battle-hardened and proud, a unit whose lineage stretched back through decades of imperial service. Yet on this morning, as thousands of Russian cavalry swept toward them across the valley, none of that history would matter. Their future, and perhaps the future of the entire Allied campaign, depended on what they would do in the next few minutes. The order to hold came from their commander, Sir Colin Campbell, a veteran officer whose steel-grey eyes had seen war in every corner of the British Empire. He was not a man prone to dramatics or speeches, but he knew the weight of the moment. The Ottoman line had collapsed. The Russian cavalry was thundering forward, intent on smashing through the Allied defences and seizing Balaclava. There was no time to build redoubts or dig trenches, no time to wait for reinforcements. The 93rd would have to stop them, here, now, in the open. Tradition dictated that infantry facing cavalry should form a square, a bristling fortress of bayonets on all sides, designed to break the momentum of a charge and protect against encirclement. It was the tactic drilled into every British regiment, the one that had broken Napoleon's cavalry at Waterloo and countless other horseborne assaults. But Campbell made a decision that defied convention. He would not form a square. Instead, he ordered his men into a simple two-rank line, thin, exposed, and dangerously vulnerable if the Russians broke through. The reason was partly practical. The enemy was coming straight on, not from multiple directions. A line could deliver more concentrated musket fire than a square, maximizing their only real advantage, disciplined volleys. But it was also a psychological decision. A square might have suggested fear, a huddle against the inevitable. A line, drawn thin and straight, was a statement. It said that they would not be surrounded because they would not retreat. It said they intended to meet the charge head-on. Campbell rode along the front, reins loose in his hand, speaking to the men in his clipped Highland voice. "There is no retreat from here," he told them. "You must die where you stand." It was not bravado, it was a simple fact. If they broke, there was nothing left to stop the Russians from overrunning the supply base and splitting the Allied armies apart. Behind them lay Balaclava. Beyond that, the sea. There was nowhere left to fall back to. The men of the 93rd understood. They tightened their grips on their muskets, adjusted the slings on their cartridge boxes, and fixed bayonets that glinted coldly in the rising sun. The ground beneath their boots trembled as the Russian cavalry advanced, a dark mass of horse and steel stretching across the valley. Trumpets blared above the din, and the rhythmic pounding of hooves grew louder with every second. Some men muttered quiet prayers. Others clenched their jaws and stared ahead, faces set with the grim determination of those who have already accepted death. There was no confusion in their ranks, no frantic shifting or last-minute panic. They had drilled for moments like this, though none quite so desperate. Orders were shouted down the line. "Hold your fire, steady, wait." The first range markers were called out by officers. 200 yards, 150. The Russian cavalry surged closer, the flash of sabres now visible above the rising dust. They had every reason to believe that the line ahead would break like a wave against a cliff. It always had before, but the 93rd did not break. At 100 yards, Campbell gave the order. A rolling crash of musketry tore through the morning air. The first volley ripped into the leading ranks of horsemen, dropping men and mounts alike in a tangle of limbs and steel. The Russians staggered, but did not stop. Another volley followed, then another. Smoke enveloped the Highlanders, the acrid, stench of powder stinging their eyes as they reloaded and fired again. Each volley cut deeper into the oncoming ranks, and the momentum of the charge began to falter. Horses veered away from the storm of lead. Riders pulled back on their reins, unwilling to hurl themselves against the wall of bullets. What had begun as a roaring tide slowed to a confused mass of hesitation and retreat. In that moment, the truth became clear. The line was holding. The Russians had expected fear. They had expected panic. What they met instead was cold, disciplined defiance. 550 men standing shoulder to shoulder, refusing to yield a single step. The fate of Balaclava, of the entire campaign, balanced on that fragile thread of courage. And against all logic, against all odds, it did not break. The men of the 93rd Highlanders had been drilled to react instinctively under fire, but nothing in their training could fully prepare them for the sight that now unfolded before them. Out of the morning haze came the Russian cavalry. Wave after wave of horsemen, their sabres catching the sunlight, their banners streaming behind them, their formations stretching wide across the valley like a dark tide rolling toward shore. From a distance, they looked less like individual soldiers, and more like a single living organism, relentless and immense. And against this, standing alone on the open plain, was a thin, unwavering line of red. The two ranks of Highlanders were so slender, so stark against the emptiness of the field, that to an observer's eye they seemed more like a mark drawn on the earth than a formation of men. Most armies facing such a charge would have formed into defensive squares, the traditional bulwark against cavalry, but Sir Colin Campbell's men had not. They stood shoulder to shoulder in a line barely two, men deep, a formation that by every accepted principle of warfare should have been suicidal. One well-placed charge could shatter it. One moment of panic could break it beyond repair, and yet they did not move. From the heights behind the line, officers, aides, and even war correspondents watched in stunned disbelief. One of them, William, Howard Russell of the Times, would later write words that would immortalize the scene. A thin red streak tipped with a line of steel. It was a phrase born of that moment, the sheer impossibility of what the Highlanders were attempting and the cold courage it took to attempt it. The Russians came on steadily, their trumpets sounding over the thunder of hooves. Dust rose around them, and the earth trembled beneath the weight of thousands of horses. The Highlanders waited in silence, muskets lowered, their faces set with the stoicism of men who knew they were about to face death. At 150 yards, Campbell's voice cut through the air. "Steady, men, steady." At 100, he gave the order they had been waiting for. The first volley crashed out like a single enormous drumbeat, tearing through the front ranks of the oncoming cavalry. Horses stumbled and fell, throwing their riders. Gaps opened in the formation, but the Russians pressed forward. A second volley followed, and then a third. Smoke rolled across the field, thick and choking, and through it the cavalry emerged. Again, closer now, but clearly wavering. The disciplined volleys had begun to sap their momentum, and the shock of charging headlong into such organized fire made even the bravest hesitate. Still, the Highlanders stood firm. Each man worked with mechanical precision: bite the cartridge, load the powder, ram the ball, fix the bayonet, aim, fire. Every shot was a deliberate, practiced act, and each one tore more strength from the advancing enemy. The roar of hooves that had once seemed unstoppable now faltered and splintered. Horses reared back from the smoke. Riders pulled hard on their reins, and the great tide of steel and muscle that had promised to crush the British line slowed to a broken wave. To the Russians, it was a bewildering sight. Cavalry charges had broken larger formations than this before. Infantry squares had crumbled beneath their weight. Yet here was a mere ribbon of men, No earthworks, no trenches, no heavy artillery, standing in the open and refusing to yield. The psychological impact was as devastating as the musket fire. The invincible momentum of the charge dissolved into confusion, and confusion soon turned into retreat. When the last of the Russian cavalry wheeled away, the field in front of the Highlanders was littered with bodies and broken horses. The ground, that should have been theirs, seized in moments by a force so much larger, remained firmly in British hands. And the line impossibly still stood. It was more than a battlefield victory. It was a moment that defied the accepted logic of war. The thin red line, as it would forever be called, proved that courage and discipline could outweigh numbers and momentum. It became a symbol, not only of British resilience, but of a deeper truth, that strength in war is not measured solely in ranks and guns, but in the will of those who refuse to break. That morning, outside Balaclava, 550 Highlanders had held their ground against the impossible, and in doing so, they wrote themselves into history. The ground shook as the Russian cavalry closed the distance, the rhythmic pounding of thousands of hooves rising into a deafening roar that seemed to rattle the very bones of the men waiting to meet them. It was a living storm of flesh and steel, 1,500 strong, bearing down upon a mere 550 Highlanders who stood shoulder to shoulder in a formation so thin it looked suicidal. The air was thick with the sound of war, trumpets blaring, drums pounding, officers shouting orders above the chaos. Dust rose in heavy clouds behind the advancing horsemen, swallowing the valley in a haze that blurred the horizon. Yet, through it all, the line did not move. The Highlanders had been ordered to hold their fire until the enemy was well within range. Every muscle in their bodies screamed to shoot, to do something as the massive wall of horse and sabres surged toward them. But discipline held them still. Sir Colin Campbell rode calmly behind the line, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Steady, men," he called. "Not yet." His presence was a steadying anchor amid the growing storm, a reminder that they were not here to panic. They were here to kill. At 600 yards, Campbell gave the order. The front rank leveled their muskets with mechanical precision, and in a single, thunderous motion, the line erupted in flame and smoke. The volley slammed into the charging cavalry with devastating effect. Men and horses toppled mid-gallop, crashing into the dirt, their momentum throwing those behind them into disarray. But the Russians did not falter. They regrouped and surged forward, closing the distance rapidly as the Highlanders reloaded. 400 yards. Another volley. This one tore into the second wave, splintering the charge's leading edge and filling the air with the screams of wounded men and dying horses. Still, they came on. The sheer weight of numbers and the inertia of their charge pushed them closer and closer, as if nothing could stop the flood. The Highlanders' faces were set like stone, their hands moving, with the unthinking precision born of endless drill. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. Each shot punched brutal gaps into the Russian ranks, but the wave did not break. At 200 yards, the situation became desperate. The cavalry was now so close that the soldiers could see the expressions on the riders' faces, a mix of fury, disbelief, and grim resolve. The ground trembled beneath the charging mass, and the wind from their advance whipped at the kilts and tunics of the men, who still stood unflinching. Campbell rode the line again, shouting over the roar of battle. "Steady! Don't give an inch!" His men obeyed. They fired again, a brutal, shattering volley that exploded into the heart of the charge. Horses screamed and collapsed, sending riders tumbling. The advance slowed, hesitated, then pressed forward again. Some of the cavalry attempted to swing wide, hoping to find a weakness in the British flank. Others pressed directly toward the center, determined to smash through by sheer force. But The concentrated musket fire was too relentless, too precise. The closer they came, the more devastating it became. At 100 yards, the Highlanders unleashed another volley at point-blank range. It was like hitting a wall of lead. Entire clusters of horsemen crumpled, their momentum dying as suddenly as if they had struck stone. The Russian cavalry began to waver. Horses reared, refusing to plunge into the storm of bullets. Riders hesitated, pulling back on their reins as they realized the madness of continuing forward. The once unified charge splintered into smaller, confused groups, their confidence shaken and their formations shattered. Some tried to regroup for another push, but the will had gone out of them. They wheeled about and withdrew, leaving the field strewn with bodies, weapons, and the wreckage of their failed assault. The Highlanders had done the impossible. Against overwhelming odds, they had stood their ground and broken a cavalry charge that should have obliterated them. Where logic dictated panic, they had shown discipline. Where fear could have caused collapse, they had shown unshakable resolve. The field before them, once filled with the thunder of hooves and the glint of sabres, was now silent save for the groans of the wounded and the distant retreat of a humiliated enemy. For the men of the 93rd, there was little celebration. They were exhausted, their ears ringing, their shoulders sore from the recoil of their muskets, but they had held. They had stood where they were told to stand, and in doing so, they had proven that courage, when forged with discipline, could stop even the most unstoppable force. The impossible charge had met an immovable wall, and the wall had not moved. For a few moments after the last volley faded into the cold Crimean air, there was no sound at all. The valley that had moments earlier been filled with the roar of hooves, the clash of sabres, and the deafening crack of musket fire now lay eerily still. Smoke drifted lazily above the field, curling and twisting in the wind, half hiding the shattered remnants of the Russian cavalry scattered across the plain. Horses writhed on the ground where they had fallen. Riders lay motionless beside them, sabres slipping from lifeless hands. And beyond them, the survivors, men who had ridden into battle with the certainty of victory, were reining in there. And mounts and turning back, their charge broken, their confidence shattered. From their command posts, the Russian generals stared in disbelief. They had expected chaos. They had envisioned a thin, panicked line of British infantry scattering before the might of their cavalry, breaking apart like dry twigs under the weight of a flood. That was how cavalry battles were supposed to end. It was what had always happened before. The sheer mass and speed of a mounted assault, the shock of sabres flashing and horses crashing into men, almost always broke infantry who were foolish enough to stand exposed on open ground. Yet here, before their very eyes, the impossible had happened. A single red line, no deeper than 2 men, had not only withstood the charge, but stopped it cold. The Highlanders themselves hardly moved. They remained where they had stood all along, shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed, their muskets still warm from the repeated volleys they had fired. Their faces were blackened with powder smoke, their ears still ringing from the thunderous reports, but their discipline held. They did not cheer or raise their weapons in triumph. They simply watched as the Russian cavalry withdrew in disarray, a mixture of confusion and humiliation spreading through the ranks of men who had once believed themselves unstoppable. Observers from the British lines were just as astonished. Officers watching from the hills behind the 93rd could scarcely believe what they had witnessed. Journalists and war correspondents scribbled furiously, struggling to find words that could do justice to the scene. William Howard Russell, reporting for the Times, would capture it best when he wrote of a thin red streak tipped with a line of steel, a phrase that would forever define the moment. What had seemed so fragile, so hopelessly inadequate against such overwhelming force, had become something far greater. A symbol of discipline, courage, and defiance. For the Russians, The psychological blow was profound. The cavalry that had charged so confidently now fell back behind their own lines, shaken and disorganized. Officers shouted orders to regroup, but the men were reluctant to press forward again. The lessons they had been taught about battlefield dominance, about cavalry's natural superiority over infantry, had just been turned on their head. If a mere handful of British soldiers could stand firm against thousands of mounted troops, what else might they be capable of? Among the British, the silence carried its own weight. The men of the 93rd knew how close they had come to disaster. A single misstep, a moment's panic, and the charge would have crashed through them with catastrophic consequences. Instead, they had held, and in doing so had accomplished something that would echo far beyond the battlefield. But there was no time to revel in the moment. The Russian threat was far from over. Their infantry still marched on the flanks, and their artillery was preparing to open fire once more. The fight for Balaclava was not yet finished. Yet something fundamental had changed. The myth of Russian invincibility, the belief that overwhelming force would always carry the day, had been broken. The Russian generals had planned for victory and prepared for pursuit. Now they were forced to rethink everything. The battlefield that was supposed to be the scene of an effortless breakthrough had become a place of hesitation and doubt. For the British, too, the moment carried a deeper meaning. They had entered the campaign outnumbered, undersupplied, and in many ways unprepared. But here, on this stretch of Crimean soil, they had shown that discipline and resolve could overturn even the most certain of expectations. Their thin red line, once seen as a vulnerability, had become their greatest strength. As the smoke cleared and the sounds of battle shifted elsewhere along the front, the men of the 93rd stood motionless, still facing the direction from which the cavalry had come. The wind tugged at their colors, and the morning sun glinted off the steel tips of their bayonets. Behind them lay Balaclava, still safe, still in Allied hands. Before them stretched a field littered with the wreckage of an enemy's overconfidence. And though the day was far from over, one thing had already been decided. The thin red line had held, and nothing on that field would ever be seen the same way again. The valley was still shrouded in a smoky haze when William Howard Russell set down his notes, his fingers trembling slightly despite the calm that had settled over the field. He had seen battles before, brutal, chaotic struggles in distant colonies and familiar European fields, but nothing quite like this. The spectacle that had unfolded before his eyes was not a great clash of armies or a sweeping maneuver of tactics. It was something quieter, more deliberate, and infinitely more extraordinary. It was the sight of a mere 550 men standing shoulder to shoulder in the face of annihilation and refusing to break. It was the sight of cavalry, the terror of infantry since the dawn of organized war, turning back not before fortifications or superior numbers, but before discipline and unshakable will. When he wrote of the scene for the Times, Russell searched for words that might capture the impossible. He described the 93rd Highlanders as a thin red streak tipped with a line of steel, a phrase that would soon be repeated in drawing rooms, barracks, and parliaments across Britain and far beyond. It was a description born in the immediacy of the moment, but it carried within it a larger truth, that the strength of an army was not merely measured by how many men it could place on a battlefield, but by how those men stood when everything seemed lost. The word spread quickly, carried, first by telegraph, then by newspaper, until they reached the heart of London itself. Readers in the British capital, thousands of miles from the muddy valley of Balaclava, were captivated by the story. They read of the Russian charge, 2,500 cavalry thundering down on a force 1/5 their size, and of the miraculous stand that had turned them back. They read of Sir Colin Campbell's calm defiance, of the Highlanders' unwavering line, and of the relentless volleys that shattered the illusion of cavalry supremacy. And above all, They read that phrase, the thin red line. It was simple, vivid and unforgettable, a symbol that captured both the fragility and the ferocity of the stand. On the battlefield itself, the echo of that phrase seemed almost tangible. The Russians, who had expected to crush the British position with ease, now found themselves regrouping under a cloud of uncertainty. Their commanders were forced to reconsider their plans, unsure if another charge would fare any better. The sight of that unbroken line, still standing silently in the open ground where it had first formed, weighed heavily on them. It was more than a tactical setback. It was a psychological blow, one that undermined confidence and sowed doubt. For the British soldiers, the words held a different meaning. They did not see themselves as heroes or symbols. They were tired, their shoulders sore from the repeated recoil of their muskets, their ears ringing from the relentless firing. Many of them were still shaken by the sheer magnitude of what they had faced. And yet there was a quiet pride in what they had accomplished. They had been given an order to stand their ground, and they had obeyed it to the letter. In doing so, they had become something far greater than a line of infantry. They had become a living embodiment of the discipline and courage that defined the British Army. The phrase, "thin red line," began to take on a life of its own, transcending the battlefield where it was born. It became shorthand for any stand, made against overwhelming odds, any moment when resolve triumphed over brute force. Military theorists cited it as proof of the enduring importance of discipline. Politicians invoked it as a metaphor for Britain's global role, a small but determined nation standing firm against larger, more aggressive powers. And ordinary people repeated it with pride, seeing in those words a reflection of their own national character. Back in the valley of Balaclava, the battle raged on elsewhere, but the scene where the 93rd Highlanders had stood remained untouched. The bodies of fallen cavalrymen and their mounts lay scattered across the field, mute testimony to the futility of their charge. Above them, the line still held, thinner now, perhaps, and weary, but unbroken. Its presence was a reminder of what had happened there, and of what was possible when ordinary men were asked to do something extraordinary. The echo of that morning would not fade quickly. It would ripple outward, across the battlefield, across Europe, across the decades, shaping how armies thought about courage, how nations understood power, and how history remembered the men who stood shoulder to shoulder and stopped the unstoppable. And it all began with a single sentence, scribbled hastily by a correspondent on a cold October morning, trying to explain how a simple line of soldiers had changed the course of a war. The silence that followed the retreat of the Russian cavalry was brief and deceptive. The battle for Balaclava was far from finished. Smoke still hung thick over the valley, and the ground still trembled beneath the weight of advancing troops and the thunderous recoil of distant guns. The Russian commanders, stunned by the failure of their first great assault, quickly adjusted their plans. If a cavalry charge could not smash the British line, then artillery and infantry would grind it down. And so the next phase of the battle began, not with galloping hooves and flashing sabres, but with the slow, relentless violence of heavy guns and massed formations. Russian artillery batteries, which had been positioning themselves throughout the morning, now opened fire with deadly precision. Shells screamed across the valley, bursting among the British and Ottoman positions with devastating effect. Earth and debris flew into the air, and men were hurled from their posts as explosions tore through the defensive lines. The Ottoman troops, many of whom had scattered during the cavalry assault, now began to regroup, forming new defensive positions and reinforcing the British flanks. They knew the next wave was coming, and it would not be swift and spectacular like the first. It would be methodical and grinding, designed to wear them down shot by shot, inch by inch. The Russian infantry advanced once more, their bayonets glinting in the pale light, They marched in disciplined ranks, drums beating and standards held high, the weight of their numbers once again pressing against the thin defensive line. The British artillery responded, belching fire and iron into the approaching masses. Each shell tore great gaps in the Russian formations, but the soldiers closed ranks and continued forward. It was a grim and relentless advance, one that spoke less of confidence now and more of grim determination. Behind the lines, British commanders were forced to make hard choices. The 93rd Highlanders and other infantry units had held magnificently, but they were exhausted and dangerously exposed. Reinforcements were limited, and the Russian threat loomed larger with each passing hour. If the infantry alone could not stop the enemy's advance, then perhaps cavalry could. Orders were given, and the British cavalry began to form up. The heavy brigade first, then the light brigade. What followed would become one of the most infamous episodes in British military history. The heavy brigade struck first, charging uphill into a Russian cavalry force more than twice its size. The clash was brief, brutal, and surprisingly successful. The Russians, perhaps still shaken by the collapse of their earlier assault, broke under the weight of the British charge and retreated in confusion. It was a rare moment of triumph in a day otherwise marked by desperate defense, but it would be followed by disaster. Miscommunication and poorly relayed orders led to one of the most fateful mistakes of the war. The Light Brigade, intended to pursue a retreating enemy, was instead directed straight into the mouth of the Russian artillery. Down a valley flanked by gun batteries on both sides, they charged 600 men against overwhelming firepower. It was an act of breathtaking bravery and catastrophic futility. Cannon fire tore through their ranks, and men and horses fell in heaps. Those who reached the guns fought ferociously, cutting down artillery crews before being forced to withdraw. Barely a third of the brigade returned. Yet even amid the carnage, the psychological balance of the battle had shifted. The Russians, who had expected to sweep aside the Allied defenses with ease, now found themselves locked in a brutal and costly fight. Their confidence was shaken, their assumptions about British resilience shattered. The thin red line had not just stopped a cavalry charge, it had punctured the illusion of Russian invincibility. The Ottomans, too, fought with renewed resolve. Their earlier collapse replaced by stubborn resistance. British infantry, though battered and bloodied, refused to yield ground. Each Russian advance was met with disciplined volleys and counterattacks. Artillery duels roared across the valley as both sides tried to break the deadlock. Balaclava had become a test not of tactics or technology, but of endurance and will. As the day dragged on, it became clear that neither side would claim a decisive victory. The Russians had failed to seize Balaclava or split the Allied armies, but the British had suffered heavy losses and were unable to mount a counteroffensive. The battle ended much as it had begun, with both sides locked in a deadly stalemate. But beneath the smoke and blood, something fundamental had changed. The myth of overwhelming numbers had been cracked. The belief that sheer force could sweep away resolve had been proven false. A handful of Highlanders had shown that discipline could turn back a tide. A doomed cavalry charge had shown that courage could defy even the most hopeless odds. And an empire that had marched into Crimea, certain of victory, now faced a war that would be longer, bloodier, and far more costly than it had ever imagined. Balaclava was not the end of the campaign, but it was a turning point, a day when perception shifted, when the invincible faltered, and when the tide of history began to turn. The morning had already produced scenes that would echo through history. The improbable stand of the Highlanders, the retreat of Russian cavalry humbled by disciplined fire. But nothing that followed would sear itself into memory quite like the doomed charge that came next. What began as a routine order amid the chaos of battle would become one of the most infamous episodes in British military history, a moment where bravery and confusion collided in a spectacle of breathtaking courage and catastrophic loss. It was the charge of the Light Brigade, and it would define Balaclava as much as, if not more than, the thin red line that had preceded it. The situation was tense and fluid. Russian forces, though shaken, still held the high ground at the end of the valley and had managed to capture several British guns. Lord Raglan, commanding from a distant ridge, wanted them retaken before they could be turned on the Allied lines. His order, written hastily and imprecisely, was carried down to Lord Lucan, commander of the British cavalry. The instructions were vague, speaking of advancing rapidly and preventing the enemy from removing captured guns. But the message lacked one crucial detail. Which guns? From Lucan's position, the only guns visible were not those captured British pieces, but the Russian artillery batteries massed at the far end of the valley. A deadly gauntlet lined on three sides with cannons. Lucan turned to Lord Cardigan, commander of the Light Brigade, and passed on the order. Cardigan, a man more accustomed to the parade ground than the battlefield, did not question it. Nor did Lucan attempt to clarify its intent. Both men despised each other and spoke only when duty forced them to. And so, with no further discussion, the Light Brigade, roughly 600 strong, composed of light cavalry meant for reconnaissance and pursuit rather than frontal assaults, formed up and prepared to ride straight into the teeth of Russian fire. The valley stretched for a mile and a half, flanked on both sides by Russian artillery and infantry, with a massive battery bristling with guns at its far end. It was a killing ground. Every military principle warned against such an attack, but the order was given and the cavalry moved. Trumpets sounded, sabres flashed in the sunlight, and the Light Brigade began its advance. At first, they trotted, then cantered, then broke into a full gallop. Cannon fire erupted from the heights, shells tearing through the formation. Men and horses were flung into the air, limbs severed, bodies mangled. Still, they pressed forward. The ground beneath them became a carpet of smoke and death. But there was no hesitation. Line after line of fire ripped into them from both flanks, yet the survivors kept riding, heads down, sabres drawn. As they closed in on the guns, the slaughter intensified. By the time they reached the Russian positions, less than half of the brigade remained mounted. But those who did reach the battery with terrifying ferocity. They slashed at gunners, cut down crews, and overran the first line of cannon. For a brief, chaotic moment, it seemed as though they might even hold the position. But they had no reinforcements, no support, and no clear objective beyond the initial charge. Surrounded and outnumbered, they were forced to retreat back through the same deadly corridor they had just crossed. The ride back was even worse than the advance. The Russians, now fully prepared, poured fire into their ranks. Horses stumbled and fell, throwing riders to the ground. Men crawled, stumbled, and died where they fell. When the survivors finally staggered back behind British lines, fewer than 200 of the original 600 remained. The rest lay dead, wounded, or captured in the valley that would forever bear their memory. News of the charge spread quickly, carried home in dispatches, and immortalized in Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, written just weeks later. Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die, became a line etched into the national consciousness, a tribute to courage untainted by the folly of the men who had ordered it. The charge became a symbol of both the glory and the tragedy of war, an example of how valor could shine even in the shadow of disastrous leadership. Yet even the spectacle of that doomed ride could not overshadow what had happened earlier that day. The sacrifice of the Light Brigade was heroic, but it was reactive, born of confusion and miscommunication. The stand of the Thin Red Line, by contrast, was deliberate, calculated, and transformative. One was a testament to human bravery. The other was proof of the power of discipline and resolve. Together, they told a complete story of Balaclava, one of blunders and brilliance, tragedy and triumph, senseless death and immortal defiance. And when the guns finally fell silent, both episodes would stand as enduring symbols. One carved in blood and smoke in the valley below, the other in a thin, unwavering line of scarlet on the ridge above. In the days and weeks that followed the Battle of Balaclava, the world's attention fixed not just on the casualties or the shifting lines of control in Crimea, but on a moment that, to many, seemed almost mythic in its simplicity. It was not the thunderous charge of the Light Brigade or the grinding artillery duels that filled newspapers and inspired endless debate. It was a far quieter scene, a single thin line of men in scarlet coats standing shoulder to shoulder in the open, refusing to yield against impossible odds. The thin red line had been a tactical decision born of necessity, but it became something far greater in the public imagination. It was no longer just a formation on a battlefield. It was an idea. In that idea lay a powerful metaphor. It spoke to something fundamental about human conflict, the belief that courage and discipline could overcome sheer force, that a few determined men could change the course of events by refusing to bend. The thin red line was, at its core, a rejection of inevitability. The Russian cavalry should have shattered the Highlanders in minutes. Everything that military doctrine, historical precedent, and common sense suggested pointed to that outcome. And yet, they did not. The Highlanders did not panic, they did not flee, they did not even step back. They held, and in doing so, they rewrote the logic of the battlefield. That message resonated far beyond the military sphere. Politicians invoked the thin red line as a symbol of national character, of Britain's steadfastness in the face of adversity, of its ability to remain unbowed even when outnumbered and outmatched. The phrase entered public discourse as shorthand for resilience. Newspapers used it to describe moments of political defiance, social resistance, even moral conviction. To hold the line became more than a military order. It became a philosophy of perseverance. Within the army, the lesson was no less significant. Balaclava proved that discipline could serve as a weapon as powerful as any cannon or rifle. The Highlanders had not relied on walls or trenches, on superior firepower or numerical advantage. Their strength lay in their training, their trust, in their officers, and their unshakable confidence in one another. It was a demonstration of how cohesion could multiply the power of a small force, how morale and steadiness under pressure could blunt even the fiercest assault. Armies across Europe studied the encounter and took its lessons to heart, rethinking how they trained and organized their troops. But the power of the thin red line extended beyond its immediate historical moment. As the Crimean War dragged on, and the world continued to modernize, the phrase acquired a timeless quality. It was used to describe the British Empire itself, a global power often stretched thin across continents, yet holding firm against challenges from rivals, rebellions, and shifting alliances. It also became a metaphor for society at large, the idea that order, justice, or civilization might rest on the resolve of a small group standing firm when everything else seemed to collapse. The story's enduring appeal lay partly in its universality. It did not depend on the reader being a soldier, a statesman, or even a patriot. Anyone who had ever faced overwhelming odds, anyone who had ever stood firm when retreat seemed easier, could see themselves reflected in that thin line of red. It was a story about human will, about the capacity to resist when resistance seems futile, to stand when standing seems impossible. Even as new technologies transformed warfare and armies grew larger and more mechanized, the spirit of the thin red line retained its relevance. It reminded commanders that courage and discipline could never be replaced by machines or strategy alone. It reminded nations that strength was not merely a function of size or resources, but of resolve. And it reminded ordinary people that sometimes the most powerful act is to stand firm. When Alfred, Lord Tennyson, wrote of the Light Brigade, he immortalized their courage with poetry that stirred the soul. But it was the thin red line that quietly shaped how generations understood heroism. It was not about charging forward into certain death, but about refusing to move when death charged toward you. It was not about glorious victories or decisive conquests, but about the stubborn, unyielding will to hold one's ground. And so, what had begun as a desperate act of necessity on a cold October morning became one of the defining symbols of the 19th century. It lived on in speeches and memorials, in classrooms and barracks, and in the shared consciousness of a nation that saw in it the very best of itself. The thin red line was no longer just a formation of soldiers. It was an idea that there is a power greater than numbers, a weapon stronger than steel, and a victory deeper than conquest. It was the proof that sometimes, to change history, all you have to do is stand your ground and refuse to fall. When the guns finally fell silent over the hills of Balaclava, the field lay strewn with wreckage, bodies, shattered weapons, and the remnants of charges that had surged forward and been repelled. The battle that had promised to be a decisive turning point for Russia ended without clear victory. The Tsar's armies held their positions, but they had failed to achieve what they had set out to do. Balaclava remained in Allied hands, the British supply line remained intact, and the siege of Sevastopol continued. It was a stalemate in purely strategic terms, a day of blood and sacrifice, without a dramatic shift in territorial control. But in the eyes of the world, something far more significant had happened. The meaning of the battle transcended its immediate result. For the Russians, Balaclava was a sobering reminder that numerical superiority was not enough to guarantee victory. They had marched into the valley with overwhelming strength, tens of thousands of infantry, waves of cavalry, and batteries of heavy artillery. By every conventional calculation, they should have swept the British and their allies aside. Instead, they had been stopped cold, first by a thin line of Highlanders and then by an understrength army that refused to break. The humiliation of watching their proud cavalry turn back before a formation no deeper than 2 men was not easily forgotten. It undermined long-held assumptions about battlefield dominance and forced a re-evaluation of how wars would need to be fought in an age where discipline and firepower could offset even the most daunting odds. For Britain, the lessons were even more profound. The Crimean War had, until that point, been a showcase of the empire's shortcomings as much as its strengths. Its army was small, its logistics poor, and its leadership uneven. Public confidence in the military had been shaken by reports of disorganization, disease, and unnecessary loss of life. Balaclava changed that. The steadfast courage of the 93rd Highlanders, the resilience of the infantry, and even the doomed heroism of the Light Brigade captured the imagination of the British public and rekindled faith in the nation's fighting spirit. Newspapers hailed the battle as a moment of redemption, a demonstration that British soldiers, no matter how outnumbered or ill-equipped, could still fight with unmatched discipline and resolve. The symbolism of the thin red line became especially powerful. It was invoked not just as a description of the events on the battlefield, but as a metaphor for Britain's role in the world, a small island nation holding back larger powers, a steadfast force standing firm in the face of overwhelming threats. The image of those scarlet-coated soldiers standing unflinching before a storm of steel and hooves became emblematic of Victorian Britain's self-perception, proud, unyielding, and possessed of a moral certainty that no enemy could shake. Military thinkers across Europe took note as well. The age of massed cavalry charges and blind reliance on sheer numbers was clearly ending. The Industrial Revolution was transforming warfare, bringing with it new weapons, new tactics, and new ideas. Balaclava illustrated that fire discipline and controlled volleys, the kind that had shattered the Russian charge, could do more damage than any heroic rush of bayonets or sabers. Armies began to adapt, placing greater emphasis on training, coordination, and the use of combined arms. The lesson was clear. In the modern era, wars would not be won by brute force alone. Even the disaster of the Light Brigade, for all its tragedy, contributed to this shift. It revealed the dangers of miscommunication and the futility of outdated doctrines, prompting debates about leadership, logistics, and the role of cavalry in modern conflict. Yet even there, the courage of the men who had ridden into the Valley of Death became part of Britain's national mythology. Tennyson's words, written just weeks later, ensured that their sacrifice would be remembered not as a blunder, but as an act of sublime bravery. Balaclava's legacy extended beyond the military. It influenced how nations understood power and how people interpreted the nature of resistance. It showed that even in an age of empire, where the strong so often dominated the weak, victory was not always a question of who had the most soldiers or the largest guns. It was also a matter of will, of the determination to stand fast when logic and fear said to run. In the years that followed, the memory of Balaclava loomed large in British culture and identity. Regiments traced their traditions back to that day. Speeches in Parliament invoked its spirit, and school children learned of the thin red line as proof of the nation's character. The battlefield itself faded into history, but the lessons it taught endured. Balaclava had not changed the course of the war in a single day, but it had changed the way wars were fought, the way armies thought, and the way a nation saw itself. And that, more than any captured ground or shifting front line, was its true legacy. The valley at Balaclava eventually fell silent. The cannon smoke drifted away, the wounded were carried from the field, and the dead were buried beneath foreign soil. The siege of Sevastopol dragged on. The war itself ground forward for many. Months and treaties would eventually redraw the balance of power in the Black Sea. But the meaning of that October day in 1854 did not remain confined to the Crimean Peninsula. What had happened there transcended the battle, the war, and even the century. It became a lesson etched into the collective memory of soldiers and statesmen alike, a lesson that would echo through every campaign that followed. For Napoleon's successors and every general who came after, the thin red line stood as a permanent warning against overconfidence in numbers and momentum. Empires had risen and fallen on the belief that mass alone could overwhelm resistance, that vast armies and unstoppable charges could sweep away anything in their path. Balaclava shattered that illusion. Here, a mere 550 men, not entrenched, not shielded by fortifications, not reinforced by overwhelming firepower, had stood exposed in the open and stopped a force that should have crushed them. They did it not with superior technology or clever maneuvers, but with discipline, cohesion, and the will to stand unmoving when logic said they should run. In the decades that followed, military theorists dissected the battle again and again. They studied the Highlanders' fire discipline, their leadership, and the decision to form a two-rank line rather than a defensive square. They examined the psychological impact of that decision, how the sight of soldiers standing defiantly in the open, refusing even the illusion of retreat, had shaken the confidence of an attacking force many times their size. The conclusion was clear. War was no longer just a contest of armies, it was a contest of wills, and victory would belong not necessarily to the side with the most men or the heaviest guns, but to the side that could remain steadfast when the pressure became unbearable. This realization reshaped military thinking across Europe. armies began to place greater emphasis on training, discipline, and morale, on creating units that could endure stress without breaking, that could remain cohesive even when surrounded, outnumbered, or outgunned. The lesson extended beyond tactics. It shaped strategy itself. Commanders learned to think not only in terms of physical objectives, cities captured, armies destroyed, but also psychological ones, the breaking of an enemy's confidence, the steady erosion of their will to fight. The thin red line had proven that once will falters, numbers mean little. The metaphor spread far beyond the battlefield. In Britain, it became a reflection of national character, invoked in speeches, literature, and politics as a symbol of resilience. The empire, stretched thin across continents, often saw itself mirrored in that line of scarlet coats holding firm against overwhelming odds. Statesmen used it as proof that Britain's strength lay not just in its fleets and armies, but in the character of its people, their steadiness, their refusal to yield. It was a story that resonated deeply in an age defined by imperial competition and rapid change. Even in the modern era, as wars grew larger and technology transformed the nature of conflict, the lesson of Balaclava endured. In the trenches of the First World War, commanders cited the thin red line as an example of courage under fire. In the desperate defensive stands of the Second World War, from Dunkirk to Stalingrad, echoes of that lesson were visible in the determination of soldiers who refused to break even when surrounded. The principle was the same. Victory depended not only on material and manpower, but on the collective strength of men who stood their ground. The power of that story lay not just in what it said about war, but in what it revealed about human nature. The Highlanders at Balaclava were ordinary men. They were not superhuman, nor were they immune to fear. They stood shoulder to shoulder because they trusted one another, because they believed in their duty, and because they knew that behind them lay their comrades, their homeland, and everything they were fighting to protect. Their courage was not reckless. It was deliberate, a decision to hold when every instinct screamed to flee. And so, long after the guns of Crimea had fallen silent, the thin red line continued to speak to future generations. It became more than a chapter in military history. It became a parable, a timeless reminder that strength is not always measured in size, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, and that the most formidable power on any battlefield is the human will to endure. On that cold autumn day, 550 Highlanders had shown the world that a line, however thin, could hold back an empire, and in doing so, they left behind a legacy that no number of armies could erase.